Chapter 4. Jewish Kagans. A strange empire rises in the east. In the middle of the 10th century, the Sephardic Golden Age, Hasdai ibn Shaprut, a physician and important statesman in the court of the Caliph of Cordoba, Obed or-Rahman III, wrote a letter to the king of the Khazars, Joseph ben Aaron. Rumors about a great Jewish empire bordering on Eastern Europe had reached the Jewish elites at the continent's western end, and aroused intense curiosity. Was there, at long last, a Jewish kingdom that was not subordinate to Muslim or Christian powers? The letter opens with a poem of praise for the king, with an acrostic composed by Menahem ben Saruk, Hasdai's secretary and the leading Hebrew poet in the Iberian Peninsula, followed by the writer's introduction of himself, inter alia, of course, as a descendant of the exiles from Jerusalem, and a description of the kingdom in which he lives. Then he comes to the point. Merchants have told me that there is a kingdom of Jews called Alcazar, and I did not believe it, because I thought they said this to please and approach me. I was puzzled about it, until emissaries arrived from Constantinople with a gift from their king to our king, and I asked them about it. They assured me that this was the truth, that the kingdom is called Alcazar, and between Constantinople and their country there was a journey of 15 days by sea, but on land there are many nations between us. And the name of its king is Joseph. And I, when I heard this, was filled with force and my hands grew strong and my hope intensified, and I bowed and made obeisance to the Lord of heaven. I searched for a faithful emissary to send to your land to find out the truth and to greet my lord the king and his servants our brothers, but it was difficult to do, for the distance is very great. Hasdai goes on to describe in detail all the difficulties entailed in dispatching the letter, and finally asks direct questions. Of what tribe is the king? What is the system of the monarchy? Is it passed from father to son, as was done by the ancestors in the Torah? How big is the kingdom? Who are its enemies, and over whom does it rule? Does war take precedence over the Sabbath? What is the country's climate? And so forth. Hasdai's curiosity was limitless, for which he apologized courteously. It is not known how long it took before the Khazar king's reply arrived, but in the extant letter King Joseph answered Hasdai's questions as best he could. He described his origin and the boundaries of his kingdom. You have asked of what nation and family and tribe we are. Know you that we are of the sons of Japhet and of his son Togarmah? It is said that in his time my ancestors were but a few, and the Lord granted them strength and boldness, and they fought with many great nations mightier than they were, and with God's help drove them out and inherited their country. Many generations passed until a king rose whose name was Bulan, a wise and God-fearing man, who put all his trust in the Lord, and removed all the sorcerers and idolaters from the country and lived under the Lord's wing. This king summoned all his ministers and servants and told them all these things. They were content, and accepted the king's judgment and entered under the wing of the Shekinah. Then rose a king of his offspring, named Obadiah, a righteous and honest man, who reformed the kingdom and set the law in the proper order, and built synagogues and seminaries and brought in many of the sages of Israel. Writing in an epic and ornate style, the king describes the conversion to Judaism, and lists the reasons that moved his ancestors to prefer the Jewish religion to the other two monotheistic faiths. In a tone suffused with fervent belief in the Torah and the commandments, he goes on to describe the location of his kingdom, its size, its population and the power of his enemies and rivals, the Russians and the Ishmaelites. Various literary embellishments of and additions to the old texts led some scholars to conclude that these letters, especially the king's reply, were not written in the 10th century CE, and might be forgeries or emendations by Muslim authors. There are two versions of Joseph's letter, a long one and a short one, but certain terms in the short version do not belong in the Arabic lexicon, and its original author was not part of the Muslim cultural world. Moreover, the distinctive linguistic use of the biblical Hebrew reversing connection, vav ha'hipyuk, indicates that Hasdai's letter and the king's reply were not written by one hand. The letter of the Khazar king was probably copied and embellished many times, but its core information seems fairly trustworthy, as it accords with contemporary Arab testimonies, and so cannot be dismissed as merely a literary creation. In any event, there is evidence from the late 11th century that despite the difficulties of international communications, copies of both letters, in several versions, were found throughout the Jewish intellectual world. For example, Rabbi Yehuda al-Batsaloni, who questioned the accuracy of these copies, commented, "We have seen some versions of the letter written by Joseph the king, son of Aaron the Khazar priest, to Rabbi Hasdai son of Yitzhak, and did not know if it was true or not." Finally, though, this sharp scholar, who detested fables, became convinced, and he admitted as much, that Khazars proselytized and had proselyte kings. "I have heard that all this is written in the books of Ishmaelites who were living then and wrote about it in their books." He therefore copied the letter of King Joseph and quoted a part of it in his own work. It is almost certain that the 12th century Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was familiar with this correspondence. He ascribed the conversion to Judaism by the Khazar monarch to a three-sided monotheistic brainstorming session. Its depiction in the opening of his work the Khazari is adapted from King Joseph's letter, with some changes in style and detail. It should be noted that Rabbi Abraham ben David, who was several decades younger than Yehuda Halevi and was one of the fathers of Kabbalah in Provence, wrote of Eastern Europe. There were Khazar peoples who proselytized, and their king Joseph sent a letter to the president, Rabbi Hasdai son of Yitzhak, ben Shaprut, to tell him that he followed the rabbinate and so did all his people. He goes on to say that when in Tolitula, Toledo, he met Jewish students who told him that they were Khazars and faithful to rabbinical Judaism. Whereas the histories of the Judeans Timurites and Berbers were all but erased from the general consciousness, it was more difficult to leave blank pages in the case of the Khazars. In the first place, the secular modern public knew about the Khazari, the theological treatise completed in 1140 C by Yehuda Halevi, a highly respected figure in Jewish tradition, and a canonical one in Zionist culture because of his particular association with the Holy Land. Second, there was a mass of historical evidence about the Khazar kingdom from Arabic, Persian, Byzantine, Russian, Armenian, Hebrew, and even Chinese sources. They all agreed that it was very powerful, and many of the sources also referred to its unexpected conversion to Judaism. Furthermore, the historical standing of this kingdom and the events that followed its breakup had been echoed in the earliest Jewish historiography in Eastern Europe, which battled with this issue for decades. Even Zionist reconstructors of the past hesitated for a long time to tackle the subject, and few of them attempted to research it with appropriate thoroughness. But the widespread interest in the Khazar kingdom eventually began to shrink, and it all but evaporated with the rise of the memory establishment in Israel, after some 10 years of its existence. Although the medieval kingdom of the Khazars existed in distant obscurity, and no gifted theologians had praised and immortalized it as the biblical authors had done in their time and place, it is, however, attested by external sources far more varied and abundant than exist about the kingdom of David and Solomon. Jewish Khazaria was, of course, immeasurably bigger than any historical kingdom in the land of Judah. It was also more powerful than Himyar or the desert realm of Dihaya el-Kahina. The story of the Khazars is fascinating. It begins in the 4th century CE, when some nomadic tribes accompanied the Huns as they surged westward. It continues with the rise of a greater empire in the steppes along the Volga River and the northern Caucasus, and ends with the Mongol invasion in the 13th century, which wiped out all traces of this extraordinary kingdom. The Khazars were a coalition of strong Turkic or Hunnic Bulgar clans who, as they began to settle down, mingled with the Scythians who had inhabited these mountains and steppes between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, which was known for a long time as the Khazar Sea. At its peak, the kingdom encompassed an assortment of tribes and linguistic groups, Alans and Bulgars, Magyars and Slavs. The Khazars collected taxes from them all and ruled over a vast landmass, stretching from Kiev in the northwest, to the Crimean Peninsula in the south, and from the upper Volga to present-day Georgia. From the 6th century on, Persian testimonies followed by Muslim ones shed light on the early stages of the Khazar saga. They invaded the Sassanid kingdom and harassed its border inhabitants. They got as far as the area around Mosul in today's Iraq. In the early 7th century, during the reign of the Persian king Khazar II, a marriage with the Khazar king's daughter sealed an alliance that enabled the Persians to build fortifications in the passes of the Caucasus Mountains. Remains of these fortifications against Khazar invasions can still be seen. Armenian and Byzantine sources reveal that in the following years the Khazar kingdom formed an alliance with the Eastern Roman Empire in its struggle against the Persians, and became a significant factor in the regional balance of power. The 7th century Armenian bishop Sabaeus wrote in his History of Heraclius, "They, Armenian nobles, went to serve the great Kagan, king of the northern lands. At the command of their king, the Kagan, they marched through the Jaw Pass to come to the aid of the king of Greece." The Kagan, this being the title of the ruler of Khazaria, maintained extensive relations with the Byzantine Empire. The future Emperor Justinian II, who had been exiled to the Crimea, escaped at the end of the 7th century to the Khazar kingdom, where he married a Khazar princess. She was rebaptized as Theodora and would later be a powerful empress. Nor was this the only marital tie between the realms. In the 10th century, the ruler and author Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus wrote, that Emperor Leo III allied himself by marriage with the Kagan of Khazaria, accepting his daughter as wife, for his son Constantine V, shaming the Byzantine Empire and himself, because he thereby abandoned the precepts of the forefathers and treated them with disdain. This non-traditional, interdynastic match took place in 732 CE, and the son born of it became the emperor who was known as Leo the Khazar. This was also the zenith of the diplomatic relations between the two mighty kingdoms. The Khazars succeeded in the course of many battles to halt the Muslims' northward sweep, and temporarily saved the Byzantine Empire from a menacing encirclement that would have precipitated its collapse. The many battles between the Muslims and the Khazars were described by numerous Arab chroniclers, who had no qualms about copying each other's work. Ibn al-Othir wrote that they fought very fiercely, and both sides held out. Then the Khazars and the Turks overcame the Muslims. After Al-Jarrah fell on the battlefield, the Khazars coveted the country, and penetrated far into it, reaching Mosul. This was in 730 CE, but the response was not long in coming. After a tremendous logistical effort and more battles, the Arab armies managed to repel the determined enemy. The commander, who would later be the Caliph Marwan II, even led strong forces into Khazaria itself, and his condition for withdrawal was the conversion of the Kagan to Islam. The Khazar sovereign accepted, and the Arab armies retreated to the Caucasus Mountains, which was agreed as the final boundary between Khazaria and the Muslim world. As we shall see, the temporary conversion of the pagan Khazar kingdom was not very meaningful, though many of its subjects accepted the faith of Muhammad. Most sources depict the Khazar kingdom as having a highly original dual government, a supreme holy leader as well as an active secular leader. Ahmad ibn Fidlan, a diplomat and author who was sent by the Caliph al-Muqtada in 921 CE to the Bulgar country by the Volga, crossed Khazaria, and described it in his rare travel notes. On the Khazars and their political system, he wrote. As for the king of the Khazars, known as Kagan, he is seen only once in 4 months, and at a respectful distance. He is called the Great Khakan, and his deputy is called Khakan Bey. It is, the latter, who commands the armies, administers the kingdom and looks after it. He sallies and raids, and the kings of the vicinity surrender to him. He goes every day to see the Great Khakan, in a deferential manner, showing himself humble and modest. More information is found in the work of the geographer and chronicler Al-Istakri, writing in about 932. His description is livelier and more picturesque. As for their regime and government, their master is called Khagan Khazar, who is more exalted than the king of the Khazars, though it is the king who empowers him. When they want to empower a Khagan they throttle him with a silk cord, and when he has almost suffocated they ask him, "For how long do you wish to reign?" And he replies, "So many years. If he dies before that time, it is well, otherwise he is put to death at that time." Only the sons of well-known families may fill the post of Khagan, and he has no real power, but is worshipped and adored when people appear before him. Yet no one enters his presence except a small number, such as the king and those of his rank. And no one is appointed Khagan except those who cleave to Judaism. Other Arabic sources corroborate the existence of a dual power system in Khazaria. This was an efficient regime, it maintained a mystique around the great Kagan, and utilized the most gifted and competent prince as the Bey, who functioned as a military viceroy. The halo of sanctity that hung over the Kagan did not stop him from maintaining a harem of 25 women and 60 concubines, though this was not necessarily in devout emulation of the biblical King Solomon. The seat of the rulers was the capital Itil, beside the Volga estuary on the Caspian Sea. Unfortunately, it appears that changes in the course of the great river's tributaries and the rise in sea level inundated the city, whose precise location remains unknown. If the kingdom maintained a documentary archive, it was lost, and scholars have had to rely mainly on external sources. Itil was largely a city of tents and wooden houses, and only the rulers' residences were built of bricks. Ibn Fidlan's description provides some details. Al-Khazar is the name of a region, and climate, and its capital is called Itil. Itil is the name of the river that runs into Al-Khazar from the land of Russians and Bulgars. Itil is a city and Al-Khazar is the name of the kingdom, not the city. Itil is in two parts. The king resides in the western part, a parasang in length, surrounded by a wall, but it is built irregularly. Their houses are made of felt, except a few that are built of mud. And there are markets and public baths. The inhabitants were no longer nomadic herders like their forefathers, but the populace still migrated every spring to the rural areas to cultivate the soil and spent the harsh winter in the capital city, where the climate was more temperate because of its proximity to the sea. Al-Istakri reported. In summer they go to the fields 20 leagues away, to sow and to gather. As some are close to the river and others to the prairie, they carry it, the produce, on carts and on the river. Their main nourishment is rice and fish. The honey and barley they send out of their country comes to them from the region of the Russians and Bulgars. Al-Istakri also described another city. The Khazars have a city named Samanda. It has many gardens, and it is said to contain some 4,000 vineyards, as far as the Serra boundary. Most of its produce is grapes. It is known that this was the Khazar capital before the rulers moved to Itil, and that fishing was an important source of livelihood for the population. So we know that the Khazars were typical rice growers and regular consumers of fish and wine, though the bulk of the kingdom's income came from tolls. Khazaria straddled the Silk Road, and also dominated the Volga and the Don rivers, which were major transportation routes. A further source of income was the heavy tax imposed on the numerous tribes governed by the kingdom. The Khazars were known for their flourishing trade, especially in furs and slaves, and their growing wealth enabled them to maintain a strong and well-trained military force that dominated all of southern Russia, and today's eastern Ukraine. Thus far, the descriptions of the Arab chroniclers coincide and even accord with the testimony of King Joseph's letter. The question of the Khazar language, however, is obscure. No doubt the great mixture of tribes and populations spoke various languages and dialects, but what was the language of the Khazar power elite? Al-Istakri, following al-Bakri, wrote, "The language of the Khazars differs from that of the Turks and the Persian language, and does not resemble the language of any other nation. Nevertheless, most researchers assume that the spoken Khazar language consisted of Hunnic Bulgarian dialects with others from the Turkic family. There is no doubt, however, that the Khazars' sacred tongue and written communication was Hebrew. The few extant Khazar documents indicate as much, and the Arab writer al-Nadim, who lived in Baghdad in the 10th century, confirms it. As for the Turks and the Khazars, they have no script of their own, and the Khazars write in Hebrew. Inscriptions have been found in Crimea that are in a non-Semitic language written in Hebrew characters. Two of these characters, Shin and Sadik, eventually entered the Cyrillic alphabet, presumably in the course of the Khazars' early rule over the Russians. Why did the Khazar kingdom not adopt the Greek or Arabic language for religious usage and high-level communication? Why did the Khazars become Jews, when all their neighbors converted en masse either to Christianity or to Islam? And another question, when did the amazing collective proselytizing begin?